if you haven't been to our site, this is a photo of it here. And I'm just going to say we have a new name. So formally, and actually this name is not right on the slide. So it should say Greenway Botanical Garden at the Naval Cemetery. Naval Cemetery Landscape is our previous name. I will tell you that Brooklyn Greenway Initiative built the site and worked with Marvel Architects and Nelson Byrd Woltz, who Scott and John are representing here. And this site is 10 years old. So we've changed our name this year and acquired Botanical Garden Accreditation through an organization called Botanic Garden Conservation International. And that's really an acknowledgement of best practices in our horticulture and our plant record systems and maintaining the sustainability of the site. A lot of that, which is a continuation of what was built and intended for the site, which John and Scott will talk about. So really exciting year for us. And I want to talk about what a greenway is really briefly, which is a bike and pedestrian lane through the city. And Brooklyn Greenway Initiative advocates for those pathways through our city to be separate from automobile traffic. So in this greenway picture, you can see there's, there's a green separation from where cars might be. In this case, it might even be going through like a built green infrastructure. And the greenway itself sort of functions as a showcase for how our greenways could function and feel for us as humans and also ecologically for other species. Next slide. So this is a little bit just summarizing our mission here. And if you're curious about advocacy for greenways and how the city is approaching the build out of various greenways, including the Brooklyn Waterfront Greenway, which is where the Greenway Botanical Garden is located upon that corridor, you could come to our summit that is happening this September and check out our website for that. Details will be posted soon. And this is just I like this because it sort of visualizes, if any of you have ever biked through the city or even some of our sidewalks are so well protected from the automobile traffic, but the idea is to have layers, at least one layer of vegetation as well, but definitely at least a barrier. In some cases, there isn't any green infrastructure; it's just sort of a gray way and way. So. And yeah, I'm not going to go into too much detail about the space because John and Scott are the experts in house, but you can reach us here.
Great. Thanks, Avvah, for the intro and getting us started off. I'll just give a quick intro about myself. My name is Scott Demel. I am an architect with Marvel here in New York. I was involved with the design of the Naval Cemetery, the Naval Botanical Garden now. We mix up our terms because it's such a new name that a lot of us who've been working with this for a decade plus still have the old name buried in our mindset. But it opened up summer 10 years ago, and I was involved with the design and the construction leading up to that in the years prior. So let's go to the next slide, and we'll talk a little bit about the context of the site and where it is within the history of the Navy Yard and Brooklyn as a whole. So the Navy Yard was established when the U.S. government actually purchased the land around Wallabout Bay in 1801. And the first commandant assignment there was made in 1806. It was an active naval facility for a number of years. Its first big ship, the USS Ohio, was launched in 1820, and it was really active, of course, throughout World War I and World War II as well. And these images give a little bit of a taste of how the Navy Yard first was established and evolved in that first century of its existence. Really low-scale development in the neighborhood around there, and a lot of the shipbuilding facilities, warehouses built around Wallabout Bay, and that little inlet you can see in the right hand that actually wrapped around its connection to the East River. Next slide. And this kind of development that was happening was common along the entirety of the Brooklyn waterfront. Not so much shipbuilding necessarily, but a lot of trade that was happening along the entirety of the waterfront of Brooklyn and New York as a whole. And this is a kind of an image of what you have seen around the mid 1800s or so, 1860, 1870, when it was sailing ships that were coming in and unloading various dry goods and such before containerization started to take hold. And the next slide, and that kind of waterfront kind of industrialization existed for a long time. It's still present, of course, in some areas around Brooklyn. It's still very vibrant. A lot of new activities happening in the city today. But this kind of image right by the Brooklyn Bridge, just about a mile or so south of where the Navy Yard is, was pretty common until the 1950s or 60s or so. And next slide, it's very different than the waterfront that you would experience as you went down there today, where Brooklyn Bridge Park has actually been developed. It's much more public. There's residential, there's hotel, there's retail activity, there's a variety of experiences that happen there that are very different from the industrial waterfront as it was established in the centuries prior. Next slide. And so this is something kind of stepping back a little bit as we hone into the Greenway site where we are. This is what the Greenway Initiative has been doing with thinking about how to connect the entirety of the waterfront for its 26 miles extent as it goes from just across from Newtown Creek all the way around to Jamaica Bay and the ocean. And where we are, next slide, if you tap, a little circle will come up where we are with the Navy Yard that's right there. So it's really all these different conditions that were happening with industrial, how it's changing over, and how that interconnectivity can be made. Next slide. And so some of those areas that you see out at Jamaica Bay at the top of the slide are very, bucolic. There are pathways that go through. You're at the seashore almost, but then you come to the city where it's much more robust and much more vibrant that's happening. And so this variety of conditions is what the Greenway Initiative was trying to design with the pathway as a whole. And part of that idea was not just necessarily the path that goes through, but making nodes of interest that happen along the greenway. So the next slide will illustrate how the greenway could interface with sites that happen its extent. Whether the greenway is something that's passing by, a kind of park space that's there, whether it's passing through an area that might have an existing park or something to be developed, or something that may actually interface with new developments happening. How could a public space, an open space, actually interface with the greenway as the waterfront is being transformed and either new buildings or existing buildings are being constructed or renovated? So the next slide, this is actually an image at the Brooklyn Navy Yard, another area around its perimeter. The Navy Yard was a fantastic partner with the Greenway as a whole because they were rethinking how their fence line, as it was a military site for centuries, literally, changed over to industrial site. How can that perimeter actually engage with the neighborhood in some way? So as they were renovating buildings, they were thinking of plaza opportunities, walkways, pedestrianization to be able to have connectivity from the street and from the greenway into their buildings. That's one aspect of it. But next slide, honing down into our site and at the Naval Cemetery site, this was a site that was underutilized. It had no activities that were happening there because of its designation as a cemetery. And the Navy Yard didn't know what to do with it. So the Greenway had the initiative and had the vision. Let's partner and develop this space and turn it into a publicly accessible space. So that's the big picture down to the site itself. And I'll pass it to John to talk a little bit more about the history of this site specifically.
Hello, everyone. I'm John Ridenour. I'm a landscape architect with Nelson Byrd Woltz Landscape Architects. So the Marble architecture team and NBW, we started this process by taking an initial deep dive into the kind of cultural and ecological history of both this part of Brooklyn, but also the region. If you can see the red arrow over on the right, that's the approximate location of the site itself. The final site size was about 1.5 acres in total. You see the East River at the top of the image in Manhattan, and you see this kind of appendage adjacent to the East River called Wallabout Bay. The Algonquin-speaking Lenape inhabited the New York City region for over 1,000 years prior to European settlement. And the Canarsie indigenous peoples covered much of what is now modern-day Brooklyn. So eventually the Dutch Walloons kind of moved into this area, and the Walloons is where you get the term Wallabout Bay. They inhabited this area and cultivated this landscape for over 200 years. And as you can see on this image, you see kind of the agrarian fields, but you also see the mud flats adjacent to Wallabout Bay. This is a very wet area, as you can imagine, and a very marshy area as well. Just to the north of the arrow, the red arrow, is Wallabout Creek. That made its way from Brooklyn, from Williamsburg, into the Wallabout Bay to the north. Next, please. So this image is from several of those Dutch farmers that inhabited this part of Williamsburg as far back as the 1630s. This image is from 1824. And this was an article in a newspaper at the time selling this plot of land that was 32 acres, 3 acres of which were meadow. And I'm just going to read a portion of this because it's somewhat interesting. It says, on the premises are a good 2-story dwelling house in complete order, a good barn, outhouses, a garden well laid out and abounding with strawberries, raspberries, the best pear and cherry trees, and the best apple orchard in the neighborhood. So this area was cultivated for agriculture for quite a long time before the Navy Yard came on. Next. So fast forward, the Wallabout Bay, the bay itself was very important for British and U.S. Ships during the Revolutionary War. After the war, the United States Navy purchased approximately 300 or acquired 300 acres of land to the south of the bay, which became the Navy Yard. The bottom right-hand side there's a kind of a U-shaped building that is surrounded by approximately, I think, 10 acres or so for the Naval Hospital. In 1824, the Navy built the Naval Hospital, and with the Naval Hospital came the need for a naval cemetery, which again you can see with the arrow to the right. Next. So this image is spun, so Wallabout Bay is to the right in this image, and you can see Wallabout Creek highlighted in blue there. This is kind of flowed through the actual site. So we took kind of the form of this sinuous meandering stream or creek, and eventually applied that to the design and layout of our eventual boardwalk. You also notice it says here sedge and meadow. Just remembering that this was a very low-lying, wet area. The striped area, kind of also within that perimeter, was the approximate location of the burial grounds. And about 2,000 people were buried in this space over time. Next. Here you see the Naval Hospital on this postcard in the distance, and the bay in the foreground. And now Scott's going to talk a little bit more about the hospital.
Yeah, thanks, John. The hospital was a pretty amazing structure. I mean, this view of it that's here, just think about this for the next couple minutes as we go through the slides, because this building is standing on its own. You can see the doctor's house just to the left, that little brown building that was there that was noted in the prior plan. And this whole area very much evolved over time from the Navy Yard itself, actually filling in the land that was in front to make more shipbuilding area that's there, and also additional buildings that came up over time. Next slide. So when you go by the Naval Hospital today, and kind of as you're biking by or walking by and kind of peek through the fence line, you see this fantastic Greek Revival building that's there, stone clad, really amazing detailing that's there, and it really stands on its own by itself as an individual presence, not unlike the postcard. Just a little bit of history. The architect for this was Martin Thompson, was the architect for the project, and there's a few other buildings in town that you can see. If you go by the Metropolitan Museum and the American Wing, the facade of what was the second branch of the United States Bank, which was on Wall Street, was moved up to be a part of the Metropolitan Museum. So you can see that building there. If you visit it, Governor's Island and go to the Admiral's House, that's the same architect, Martin Thompson. And if you go to Central Park and visit the Arsenal, Thompson again. So there's a number of extant buildings or portions of them here within the city. Next slide. But again, this was an active hospital facility throughout the wars, Civil War, World War I, World War II, and it existed as an active hospital until around 1948, I think was the year that it was decommissioned in its final. And next slide. And the cemetery site itself, that was used as an active burial ground until 1926. You can see the layout here of some of the headstones. To the left of the image is actually the brick wall that you can see if you visit the cemetery site today. That's the brick wall at the back side. And so a lot of the burials that were here, there were 987 bodies that were moved out to Cypress Hills under an act of Congress. And then the cemetery was deactivated. But it was only later that there was additional research that was done and realized that there were probably over 2,000 burials that actually occurred at this site. So at that point, it was a realization that there were still remains that were here. The Navy, when they were still operating or active at the site until the mid 1960s, when they sold it to New York City in 1966, they stopped using the site whatsoever, and it just laid unused and pretty much fallow over time. Next slide. So this image is an aerial view of 1924. So you can see, if you look closely, if you tap on the next, you should see a couple circles show up. So you can see the hospital building. It's there on the left-hand side. A lot of wings and extensions were built onto that, treating different issues, also because of separation with different diseases and tuberculosis, trying to separate people out with physical separation from people. But also on the right-hand side, you can see what was in that prior diagram that Sean had showed of the diagonal striping, that kind of D shape that was there. You can see that with the tree-lined area, that is the Naval Cemetery. And this was 1924, so just before it was deactivated, and the remains were exhumed and relocated. And the next slide will show a modern image that's there. So you can see all of those outbuildings that surrounded the hospital have been removed. It's open field, and you can see the location of the current cemetery that's there and that boardwalk that wraps around it. Next image.
Okay, I'm going to walk you all through the design of this space. Again, Nelson Byrd Woltz worked closely with Marvel Architects and Larry Wiener, Landscape Associates, who we work with closely on the development of the meadow design and management plan. So at the south end, or I should say the east end of this image, at the bottom is Williamsburg Street, and not too far from that is, if you all know Brooklyn, the kind of large BQE, Brooklyn Queens Expressway that runs through from Williamsburg all the way through and around to the left into Clinton Hill and Fort Greene area before extending onward. So there's a very distinct kind of hard urban edge here that's quite loud, actually. The sidewalk is an existing sidewalk that was already there, and then adjacent to that sidewalk was a painted greenway, which was part of the larger, longer greenway that Scott mentioned earlier by BGI. Stepping up from the sidewalk, you enter into this amazing space developed by Scott and team that is kind of a threshold into this much larger space. There's a little sense of kind of elevation from the sidewalk, but also elevation up to a boardwalk level. There's an ADA route there on the left that gets you up to that same space. So you're kind of immediately transported from kind of the urban jungle, the hardscape of Williamsburg and the city into this much more vibrant, green, kind of quiet space. You take a walk, kind of a loop around the boardwalk, and you immediately see the Memorial Meadow in the foreground, and then kind of skirting around the outside. Up to the top right is the amphitheater, which was just a kind of a form that allowed for some elevated seating for K through 12 education, kind of the start of tours or other programming that would take place kind of in that corner. And then continuing along the pathway you make to the upper left, make your way to the Sacred Grove, There we see a kind of a grove of what are black cherry trees, very prolific trees, sometimes too prolific, but also kind of provide a nice dappled shade into that space where you can still see out through the grove into the memorial meadow beyond. The small gray boxes that you see there are large pieces of granite kind of cut distinctly. That is a nod to the Navy Yard. They're meant to kind of evoke the mooring blocks that were associated with the Navy Yard over time. They're also an abstract reminder that this place is a place of burial, almost like headstones to some degree. So you get a sense of the kind of openness of the memorial meadow in the center, and then a lot of existing evergreen and deciduous trees around the edge, along with some new planting of new smaller trees as well. Next. So as we developed the kind of documents for this project, this is just a simple diagram showcasing kind of the all of the curvature associated with making this a meandering boardwalk, again, meant to kind of evoke that initial wallabout creek that made its way through the site. Next. And then here's this kind of experience of leaving what is kind of the dense urbanity of Williamsburg, stepping up into the space, into the sunlight in this case, and then kind of experiencing the meadow as you make your way through. Scott?
Yeah. I mean, this entryway it's serving a number of things as well as the staircase, because it is that threshold moving from city into landscape into kind of regular space into sacred space, let's say. It's also doing some practical things because there is a lot of grade change that happens at the site just to bring you up from the level of the street and the sidewalk that's there in the foreground, just to get to the level of the site itself, because there is some pitch that's there. But of course, the boardwalk itself, it's elevated above the site another 18 inches or so. And so you've got to navigate that change as well. So there's really kind of a formality of coming up to the stairs, up through the threshold, and kind of changing your mindset as you enter into the landscape. This is the main staircase, and there's a ramp that's leading from the left-hand side. Go to the next slide. So a plan view that's going to come up, just showing that kind of vantage point as you're coming up from the street and from the Greenway, stepping up those steps. The building serves as a pretty simple little structure for a small office that's there, storage of some maintenance materials and such, and a little seating area. But that's manipulated in a way so that it opens up, and your viewpoint actually, when you're looking through that threshold, there isn't a lot of building per se that gets in your way. So it really opens up as you walk into the space, step onto the boardwalk, and then decide to circulate to the left or to the right and experience the space. Now, part of the construction of this that was challenging, if you talk to the next slide, was that there was a lot of review that was done with the State Historic Preservation Office and the archaeology that was done at the site. And from that research that I mentioned before, that there were numerous remains that were still on the site in some locations. They weren't marked. It wasn't known where they were. And so really doing any kind of digging or excavation or earnest earthwork into the site was really impossible to do. And so the strategy to develop the structure was to have a very lightweight foundation system that moved across the entirety of the site. And so these little diamond-shaped concrete elements were set across the site, minimal amount of excavation that was done in the top, 6 or 8 inches or so of soil. And then what you can see in the right-hand side of the image, those diagonal steel rods that are there, those are actually driven down into the site effectively with a hammer. And those are long enough that they engage down below the frost line and prevent the little diamond pieces, those concrete elements, from actually heaving up out of the earth. And so that's the foundation system for the entire boardwalk and for the little threshold structure that's at the front door of the site. So next slide, and we'll progress through a few construction images. You can see on the left side a little bit those little posts that are coming up. Those are the wood posts that are set on top of those concrete elements. The framing that's installed across the entirety of the site that's laid out so it can accommodate the decking and the orientation of the decking, spans that are required for it. Next slide. And so the decking that's used across the site, this is the black locust wood that's installed. So this installation here, it's fairly fresh and it's kind of a red coloration. The later slides, you're going to see it all ages out and becomes more of a gray tone. This is a wood. This is a pretty big topic when this project was designed at this point, maybe 12, 13 years ago or so, really thinking about tropical hardwoods, the use of ipe, what are alternatives to that? And this was a method that was very common at the time, 10 plus years ago, to be thinking about using black locust. It's a local native North American species that's relatively readily available. The contractor who built out the site, Kilco Landscape and Construction, they actually worked with a forester who is, I think, mainly upstate in New York. Actually got whole trees, brought them back to their carpentry shop and fabrication shop in Long Island, planed the trees all down, made lumber out of them in different sizes, different radii, and then laid them out onto the site for installation. So this image is showing that initial layout with kind of the jagged edge. And next slide will show after those edges are all cut and a little bit of weathering on the site, you see it changing that color. So this is the end product of how you experience the boardwalk today. And again, noting that here, the plant life, this is just after, maybe a year after things have been installed. Everything's kind of low with the planting that you see. Next slide, you'll see as the site evolves with the planting, things start to come up. You see a lot more variety as things are being established, and they're starting to flower out in different ways. Next image. You could start to see in the background of this slide on the left, that amphitheater that's there. It's a series of stepped benches and kind of table levels or kind of high tops that are there, just for a variety of seating levels or experience levels. Next slide. So you can sit on some of those areas and look out onto the garden and onto the landscape that's there and have a quiet moment. But it's also a very active space depending on the program that's invited to the site. So on the next slide, we'll see there's um, various physical activities, yoga, stretching, engagement that's happening. There's educational activities that happen as well on the top right-hand side. Classes can come out here and have instructional aspects. There's actually been some fashion shows that have happened at the site for walkthroughs using different areas of the boardwalk. Just kind of in the bottom images, looking at nature, doing bird watching, looking at insects as well. And there was also on the bottom right-hand side, there was a bee program that was here for a number of years at the beginning of the establishment of the meadow to help bring the pollinators coming through here and help establish all of the plant life. Next slide. And so some additional images of bird watching, insects, looking at the plant life, understanding what those are, and also another way of using those benches of that amphitheater with the layout of different plant life and different bird species that are there as an educational program. Next slide. And so those stone blocks that John mentioned previously, those kind of mooring blocks, it's a marker for the site to give some grounding to what is this kind of light boardwalk and the lightness of the plantings that moves around. But if you're spirited enough, like this woman, you could move across those and move into the landscape in a different way. And again, this image is early on, the lowness of the plantings you can see, but the next photo, you could see some of that growing up. You could see those little trees that are there. And the next image are actually starting to come up again and make some more space that's there. So it actually makes that grove a little bit more of a quiet location within the landscape. And I'll mention on this image as well, all those boards when you go and walk the site, all those are planed and radiused out. So they actually go from a thinner taper on the inner portion of the circle to a wider taper outside. So that was one of the fantastic things that the Kelco had done for us when they were in control of all their carpentry work for us. So I think next John will take us through some of the more specifics of the planting with what was found on site and how that's evolved with the installation to today.
Yeah, so this is what it kind of looked like on day one when we first got there. This is Jeffrey Longhenry in the foreground, former colleague at Nelson Byrd Woltz Landscape Architects. In front of him, there's Larry Weiner on kind of the initial site visit. And this was one space on the site that was quite interesting. this is like a successional landscape. I think these are, invasive white mulberry. But you get this sense of interesting kind of level of canopy, mid-story canopy, and this dappled shade that makes its way down to the ground plane. So part of the idea was to kind of evoke this with the different species in the sacred grove that we showed earlier. The other part of the site was primarily open and was largely overrun with invasive species such as mugwort and Lespedeza, and a number of others. There's a kind of constant pressure of the invasive pressure from both the Navy Yard and from the surrounding Williamsburg area. All kinds of bad things kind of coming in here at all times. So maintenance we knew was going to be a definite issue over time. Next. So, as part of the initial design process, when we started to think about planting, we thought, what better way to honor those that were buried here than by promoting life, by promoting both pedestrian life, but also promoting a habitat capable of enticing pollinator species. So we looked at the site itself in the center of the circle, and then looked out about 2-mile radius and tried to understand at the time the kind of general lack of green space and pollinator specific green space. I'm sure this has changed a lot in Brooklyn in the past 10 to 15 years, which is a great thing, but this is part of our initial dive into the design process. Next. So we developed a plant palette. This is just a small portion of the plant palette with Larry Riener's team, again, focusing on pollinator species, focusing on seasonal change and color. There's discussions about what's the right percentage in this case of grasses versus forbs. But yeah, we see a lot of these same species there today. And again, there's the actual plant list is much longer than this, but this gives you a glimpse of what's there. Next. So as Scott mentioned earlier, the State Historic Preservation Office required that we basically couldn't go below 4 inches in depth with anything. That was especially true for excavation of footings. It was also true for planting as well. So we ended up with a seed mix in most locations across the whole site, but we also ended up with kind of small plugs that were no more than 3 or 4 inches deep. We developed a seed mix with Larry Riener's team that looked at sun and shade patterns, looked at moisture levels. So the entire site got some level of seed mix. And then on top of that, image on the left shows these kind of bands of red. Those are the plugs, kind of monocultures of plugs on top of a diverse seed mix. And these bands are meant to evoke kind of this geometry of burial, kind of these sliding lines of bands migrating across the site. And in the image on the right, you can see that those plugs going in and those lines of string lines that were kind of guiding them as they place plugs. But those lines also are aligned with the boardwalk orientation you see there below. So they had this kind of holistic geometry associated with this big diagonal. We knew that this was going to be something that was distinct early on, but then over time it would self-seed. You'd get the seed mix that comes up, and you get this migration of species, migration of color over time. Next. This is my favorite photo. This is when the plugs finally arrived from various locations, including I think North Creek and Roundstone, but a number of others in and around the city. So yeah, this was a very exciting day, and kind of like it was like Christmas a little bit early that year. Next. And this is what it looked like within 2 years of that implementation of seed and plugs. You get a sense of the height of the meadow in relationship to the boardwalk, which is about 18 inches above grade. And you also get a sense of the kind of enclosure, the thicket of canopy in the background, with the occasional view of Williamsburg in the distance. Next. So this is an image. This is of my daughter on the right, who at the time was about 3 or 4 years old, I believe, and her grandfather. She has just turned 13, so that gives you a sense of now this project is taking on about a decade or a little bit more than a decade of time being installed. So what I love about this image again is the kind of edge condition, the thick and the top band, the mid scale band of pollinator species, and the silvered black locust boardwalk at the bottom. Next. And the goal was that it was beautiful in all seasons. And so here you see the top left spring, late spring, summer on the top right, fall on the bottom left, and kind of a dusting of snow in the wintertime on the right. One of my favorite times to be at the garden is in the winter. Next. Some of that winter interest in terms of plant species. And the following image, next, is just the kind of vibrant colors and the life that is now in this place that was historically overrun by invasives and paving. Next. And these are just a few kind of close-ups of, again, the abundance of life that's here in all forms. A lot of pollinator species and insects kind of constantly providing buzz of activity as you meander through the site. Next. The bird list, it's around 100 birds have been identified, and I think that continues to grow over time. And then the next slide just showcases the ongoing maintenance that is extremely important here, whether that's BJI, staff, Avvah and her team of BJI are doing a wonderful job there. And I think get a fair amount of volunteer experience or volunteer helpers to help with the constant maintenance that's required in this space. Next.
Yeah, so it's been a amazing evolution of the site. I mean, it was built into the design intent of it to have those initial seatings and plugs be put into place to kind of create a geometry. Those have grown up into a certain pattern, have kind of evolved, and now like we're seeing all the species that are there and the diversity that's here. That's really what's kind of surprisingly for us, and beautifully evolved it into what is now a botanical garden with that designation, which I don't think is anything that we had as a design team from the construction or landscape side had really intended for that to happen, but it's been a fantastic evolution that came about. And in the design of the space and in the conception of the space, I mentioned the Greenway initiative and their vision to kind of adapt the space. Their partner with the Brooklyn Navy Yard Development Corporation to assign this space to rethink it as this landscape space, this public space. But also another key partner has been what was the TKF Foundation, now known as Nature Sacred, changed their name. And so this bench that you see here is one of the benches that, as they provide support and funding for these projects to go forward, they always place this bench within their projects. This is a large landscape. Other projects that they've done around the country have been in other housing developments, part of recovery places, hospitals, things like that. So different places where they're thinking about the opportunities for people who are in urban or stressful environments to be able to engage with nature and kind of take a pause for a moment. Next slide. And so that bench that's there, this image is actually of Milton Puryear, who was one of the founders of the Brooklyn Greenway initiative, and thinking about this place. And what's part of this bench is it's a place to sit and to think. But that book that he's holding there is actually a notebook or a diary that's there. And it's in the little pocket that's underneath the bench itself, in a little wood sleeve with a little protective covering over it. And the purpose of it is for anybody who comes to the site, if they're having a thought or want to share something or an observation, you could go and actually just write that in the book for what's there. And anybody from kids to adults can put their thoughts in there. I've read things from a kid who came to visit the site, and at the time there were little, red bugs that were crawling across the boardwalk or ladybugs, and it said, "Watch out for the bugs, don't step on them." Or you'll see other kind of really deep and personal thoughts that individuals write in there. Go to the next slide. And so some of those things that are in the diary, this woman Jenya, who had written something in 2017. I love coming here, such a beautiful and peaceful place. I like to sit here and just to be. No rush anywhere and just be, a place to find myself. And Nature Sacred, they collect these books and the writings that are there and think about how people are interacting with their spaces and nature. And they make some of them available as research or thinking about their interactions with nature. They have some publications they've done. They actually have a website and a podcast where they talk about some of these elements as well. It's at naturesacred.org at Bench Stories, if you want to look those up. Next slide. So it's really evolved into this amazing space in a way that I don't think a lot of us conceived of it. We built some of it into the design, but it's really evolved into a place and a system unto its own that a lot of people have really enjoyed. That's very satisfying for us. So with that, we'll wrap up, and I think we'll open it to any questions. Or Christiana, if you want to ask us a few, we could open it up to dialogue.
Yeah, we've had a couple of questions land in the chat. I want to encourage everyone, if you have questions from the presentation, put them in the chat now. We'll give you a moment to do that while people kind of collect their thoughts and think what they might want to ask. Scott and John, 10 years on, I'll kick it off with a question to ask how or if at all has the site, as you've seen it grow into itself in this decade, has it evolved in ways that maybe you didn't expect or that have surprised you? If you could kind of tell us what your reaction is now from day one to day whatever 365 times 10 is.
I'll start. I think one of the things is just the programming that has happened here. It's amazing and constantly changing. I know there's artists that do amazing things here on an annual basis. As Scott mentioned earlier, there was a runway. I don't think we ever imagined any of that when we first designed this. So just seeing how it's been so flexible of a space and people are able to use it in so many different ways has been really something nice to see.
Yeah, it's still very much a found space, I think. It's a landscape public space that's different than really any other kind of, call it, park space that exists in the city, because it is very informal, it's very soft, it's not heavily programmed with a lot of specific intent. But I think how that programming has evolved has been fantastic. And like I mentioned, just this evolution of the amount of species and plantings that are here, how they've evolved has been really fantastic in a way that I don't think any of us really foresaw the depth of it.
Wonderful, thank you. And obviously, New York City is not immune to climate change. We've had extreme weather just in the last couple of weeks with flooding, the secondary effects from wildfires elsewhere. How did climate change inform your horticultural decisions or the selections that you were making for the garden?
Well, the large majority of the plants that were used were native species. So I think that's a first step in helping to ward off climate change. So even the boardwalk itself is a native black locust.
Mm-hmm.
The native planting, the roots are deeper, storing more carbon, able to be more resilient over time with fluctuation in temperature and other stresses. So yeah, just I think from our standpoint, from the landscape architect standpoint, really focusing on a native palette.
Perfect. In the chat, attendees are curious to hear a little bit more about ongoing maintenance of the meadow, in particular irrigation. How is that brought into the picture? And is it? I mean, so many of us have lawns. We're used to mowing. How is it maintained in that way? Does it mow? Does it simply respond to the seasons and then it's cut down and regrown? Can you speak to a little bit about the seasonality of ongoing maintenance?
In terms of irrigation, I believe there was, and I apologize, it's been about a decade now, so I'm trying to remember. There was temporary irrigation set up. I believe there is a hose bib on site. Can't remember if there's one or two. But there was temporary irrigation set up to just help in that establishment phase. But other than that, there's no irrigation on site after that initial establishment.
Yeah,
And
that's right, John. There, if in a
okay.
couple of the prior photographs, if you're looking closely, you could see a few of the on stake, some of the sprinkler heads that were around the site. That was those were there just the first couple of years to get things established. And there was a call it a secret couple of hoses that were snaked underneath the boardwalk when it was being put together to get water distribution to those locations. But there's no hard piping or anything that's into the landscape at all.
Yeah, yes, you're correct. No irrigation on site. And, again, going back to native species selection, that really helps us. Those are plants that have, evolved over many, many years with the climate patterns for our area, even though they are changing a little quickly. And you can definitely read the drought sometimes in the landscape, but I think that actually adds a layer of sort of engagement for visitors. I mean, sometimes it's nice to, when we're suffering from these dry, hot, long, longer than usual droughts, to see that in the landscape and then to come back and see how resilient that these species are through that. And that I think it'd be really interesting to study the sort of seed and genetic sort of change that might have happened even in just 10 years from these plants self-selecting as those that can survive without that extra water. There's a lot of native plantings in New York, and a lot of them get, a lot of water as, because their sites are plumbed. So that's been really interesting from a horticulture, my background being horticulture and many other institutions. It's been really interesting to watch the site over many years in that regard. And then the other, the one thing I'll address with the cutback that somebody asked about, or whether we cut this, we do cut back. You might have noticed on the winter slides, there were a lot of seed heads that were showing winter interest. Those are left up for multiple reasons. And that helps actually keep more life on site. Like if the idea is that plant selection is a foundation for the other life that gets brought onto the site. Winter habitat, keeping the stems up over the winter is a key factor in that. Keeping things up for shelter for birds and other small life that may be there. Even like fireflies, not keeping tall grasses and keeping them up, and the soil is retaining moisture year-round, which is needed for their life cycles. So all kinds of really deliberate horticultural choices on this site.
Thank you. And I'm going to keep going with the questions. I'm just going to advance the slide, though, because I'll pause for a moment because we do have some upcoming events at the garden hosted by BGI. So please mark your calendar. If you have never been and experienced the garden, experience the public programming. We have upcoming opportunities as soon as this Saturday, Firefly and Sunset Ecology Walk, and then other programs in September. You can find these on the brooklyngreenway.org website and Eventbrite. But I also want to leave this up for the remainder of the Q&A. Again, for those of you here who are attending for continuing education credit, please take note of these details. In particular, Avvah's email, Rossi, AROSSI, at brooklyngreenway.org. Make sure you're following up as noted here to get your credit. So I think we have time for just a couple more questions. Let's see. How does the Greenway route relate to the garden? Do you think about the garden as a resting place for someone biking or walking along the Greenway? What kind of support are there for visitors, such as a restroom? Avvah, maybe you're...
should I field this? Yeah. Yeah. I think we're definitely a part of the Greenway. Yeah. The Greenway goes through many different types of green spaces, whether those are like private public development spaces or Brooklyn Bridge Park, or it goes next to Shirley Chisholm Park out in East New York. So I think we as a advocacy for accessibility, being part of our mission, like I think we emphasize the connections and not the separation from that. And then beyond that, yeah, it's a good question. It's not, I think Scott was saying this earlier when we were talking, like it's outside of this, but it's not like a traditional, I guess, like park space where you would have the amenities of, a restroom on site. It is a place to observe nature. And it's also like in many ways a non-traditional botanical garden, and that a lot of our signage and interpretation for the site is sort of like self-guided or choose it or come to a program, but you are able to sort of just experience the site for what it is, and also sort of like for what you want out of it, and in that nature connection moment. So that said, we have recently added water, so not a plumbed water, but we pick up water jugs, and we set up a drinking station for people using the Greenway. So that includes anybody walking or running by, and also cyclists that want to stop, and in a way that welcomes them in, and gives them a resource that we all need in the heat, especially for the summer. But we have it year round now. So yeah, it is certainly, I think, connected, and we try to our main sort of resource that we offer is the connection to nature itself, and then some of our programming really is designed for you to use it there, but also like use the skill sets and the knowledge that you gain by engaging with us elsewhere. So
I'll just add that there's bike parking in front
yes,
of the
great
international
question.
inspector, so you can jump off your bike and take a quick stroll around the boardwalk.
And
Yeah,
if
thanks,
anybody's
John, we
listening
do.
if anybody's listening from City Bike, it would be great to have a City Bike location here named
Yes.
for the botanical garden.
Excellent.
I think we might have time for just one more question, and I might kind of merge two of the questions I'm seeing together because they are both regarding the boardwalk. Going back to the beginning, if Scott and John, if you're comfortable talking a little bit about the documentation and construction of the boardwalk a bit, you did mention that in the Sacred Grove that those planks were I'm blanking on the word tapered. That they were already tapered to really accommodate that design. How much of that was prescribed? How much of that was, the question is, how much of that was prescribed? How much was left to the carpenter or the installation team to kind of take your vision and execute? And also, speaking of the boardwalk, a question about ADA. Is there, what might be the requirements on the boardwalk for any kind of curbing? So kind of construction of the boardwalk and then evolving into current uses.
Yeah, the for the radii, I think the short answer is we had carpenters who are ready to go all out on it. They made a little custom jig to figure out what the radius was and how to taper those appropriately. And then they just cut them. I mean, that was always the intent to do that. I think, frankly, we got a little bit lucky with enthusiasm and with a construction group, carpentry group who was milling their own wood quite literally, so they could get as much as they needed to out of every board and every tree that was there. I admit it was a little bit of a challenge to get that done, because if you ever worked with black locust or seen them out in the wild, they're not exactly a straight long tree all the time. They're a little bit bendy and a little bit wonky. So to get boards like that are consistently that long for that, however wide it is, that 12-foot or so designation was pretty fantastic to do that. So I think that's a little bit of intent and enthusiasm on the carpentry side. In terms of accessibility, just talking broadly, I mean, it is an accessible site coming up from the street, from the sidewalk. There's an entry ramp. We showed mostly pictures of the staircase, but you could see in the plan there's an entry ramp that leads you up that about 5-foot or so elevation change from the sidewalk over to the height of the boardwalk. The sidewalk's actually working to advantage because as you go to the left a little bit, it's grading up. So that helps out somewhat. But the boardwalk itself, it never gets too high above the landscape itself. Although when you see it now today, you're not quite sure where the bottom is, so to speak, because it's kind of obscured by the robustness of the plantings. But the boardwalk is pretty wide at all locations. There's plenty of opportunities for turning radii and full, 180 to reverse direction, things like that, or even for gathering space. So the edge wasn't a concern.
Well, well, we're a smidgen past 7, so I want to be respectful of everyone's time. Thank you, Scott, John, and Avvah, for your time, for your expertise, for sharing all your knowledge. There were certainly questions we weren't able to get to from the audience, but folks, please don't hesitate to follow up with BGI, and we're happy to pass questions along. You can, of course, reach out to Scott and John directly through Marvel Architects and Nelson Byrd Woltz Landscape Architects. Please, again, pay attention to all the specifics if you're intending to submit for credit for continuing education. The details have been up here on the screen, and if you have questions, email Avvah. And I think with that, we're all good for the evening. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good night, all.